Welcome back to ILTV on the Hour. We're live in Israel, bringing you the biggest headlines from the region. It's currently 2 p.m. here in Israel and 7 a.m. in New York. I'm Khaled Ben David, and today is day 692 of the war in Gaza. Let's get into all the top headlines at this hour. Israeli troops ferried by helicopter reportedly raided a base on a key hilltop near Damascus. According to Syrian sources, the airborne operation went on for 2 hours and targeted Jabal Mania, which was once a major air defense base operated by Iran before being destroyed by Israel prior to the fall of Bashar al-Assad. Troops from the new Syrian army are reportedly now positioned at the base. Syria's official Sana news agency reported that initial Israeli drone strikes targeted soldiers who, while on patrol, discovered several surveillance and eavesdropping devices. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights claimed that the base was used to store weapons for Hezbollah until the fall of Assad. While Israel did not confirm the attack, Defense Minister Israel Katz later posted that the IDF is fighting on all fronts, day and night. U.S. President Donald Trump presided yesterday over a White House meeting advertised as a discussion of policy planning for post-war Gaza. But after the session, the White House downplayed its significance, this despite U.S. Envoy Steve Witkoff having said beforehand it would be a large meeting to discuss the Trump administration's comprehensive plan for Gaza the day after the Israel-Hamas war. The discussion did include former British Prime Minister Tony Blair and Jared Kushner, who served as White House Middle East envoy during the first Trump administration. Now, Blair has been working on a post-war Gaza plans for several months now. The White House said that all aspects of the Gaza issue were discussed, including an increase of humanitarian food delivery, the hostage crisis, post-war plans, and more. Despite the range of issues and the presence of top policymakers, the White House insisted this was a normal policy meeting and they had nothing to share at the end of the discussions. Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer is in Washington and met senior White House officials just prior to the White House Gaza policy session. Shortly after the meeting, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio held his talks with visiting Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar, highlighting the close coordination between Washington and Jerusalem. Meanwhile, in Gaza, the IDF said it destroyed dozens of terror targets over the past 24 hours as its forces continued actions throughout the entire strip. In South Gaza, the Golani Brigade combat team eliminated several terrorists and destroyed several terror infrastructures. Also, fighters from Brigade 188 advanced in Khan Yunis, aiming to establish operational control over the key access connecting the east and west parts of the city. In the northern part of Gaza, the Givati Brigade destroyed several underground tunnels used by Hamas in Jabalia. Meanwhile, the IDF continues to boost its tank forces along the border in preparation for its push into Gaza city. The IDF also announced plans to add 2 humanitarian and distribution centers in southern Gaza to receive the new influx of displaced Palestinians from the north. The United Nations Security Council is set today to vote on a resolution that would end the mandate for UNIFIL, the UN peacekeeping troops in South Lebanon, on December 31st. Security for the border area would then be handed over to the Lebanese army, this following the decision by the Lebanese government calling for the disarming of Hezbollah by the year's end. Israel has long criticized UNIFIL for being ineffective in standing up against Hezbollah violations of the agreements reached at the end of the Second Lebanon War in 2006. In response to Hezbollah attacks on northern Israel following the October 7th massacre, the IDF set up 5 forward defensive positions across the Lebanese border. But following U.S. mediation between Jerusalem and Beirut, Israel has now agreed to withdraw from these outposts once the decommissioning of the terror group's weapons gets underway. Hezbollah said it would not agree to giving up its arms with the support of its sponsor, Iran. Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, said that, quote, almost 50 years after UNIFIL's creation and 19 years after its mandate was expanded following the Second Lebanon War, it is time to dissolve the force. Reality has shown that UNIFIL has failed in its mission and has not prevented Hezbollah's buildup. Well, joining us now to discuss all of these issues is retired Ambassador Yoram Ettinger. He is an expert on U.S. Israel relations and the Middle East. Ambassador Ettinger, are you with us? Very good. First of all, I just want to get your reaction, your analysis to some of these statements and moves that have been coming out of the White House. On one hand, we have President Trump saying a few days ago he expects the Gaza war to be wrapped up in 2 to 3 weeks. Then we have this meeting, which was first built up as a big meeting at the White House. Now afterwards, it's kind of being downplayed. What do you make of these latest developments?
Well, President Trump has been consistent. He has been consistently the most pro-Israel president ever since 1948. He's the first president who literally has neutralized the establishment of the State Department, appointing Secretary Marco Rubio, who is anything but the State Department establishment. However, at the same time, President Trump observes or assesses the Middle East through transactional, business-like lenses. And the Middle East, in fact, the world as a whole, are anything but an arena for business transactions. It reminds me of the reaction by the entire West to the eruption of violence on the Arab street at the end of 2010, when the West was elated, embracing what they called Arab Spring. An Arab Spring, the term, is a testimony to the naivete, the detachment of Western foreign policy establishment from the real Middle East. It has been Arab tsunami all along, from end of 2010 until this very day. The attitude is reflected through negotiation. Middle East negotiation is not Western negotiation. For President Trump, he sends his emissary Witkoff to the Middle East to negotiate in an attempt to reach reconciliation. However, for the other side, the Ayatollah of Iran, Hamas, the Houthis, negotiation is simply time out to lick their wounds, to prevent a tougher military bidding, and to bolster capabilities to allow the Chinese and North Korean, maybe the Russian.
Well, Yoram, let me ask you then, because as you said, President Trump has supported Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, in his stated goal of destroying Hamas, freeing the hostages, but destroying Hamas. But are they on the same timetable? It does seem that President Trump is lately giving signs he wants this thing wrapped up more quickly than maybe militarily it will take for the IDF to eliminate Hamas in Gaza.
Well, it's a typical Western attitude, which unfortunately some Israelis have adopted. Settlement now, agreement now. The Middle East is a very patient region, and things work not in a sprint-like manner, but rather in a marathon, and usually multi-generational marathon. And therefore, there's no end to the war with Iran. There is a ceasefire, which they are utilizing to restore their capabilities. For Israel, the most important thing is not to follow the timetable set by Western policymakers, even by the most supportive president ever, President Trump. The most important thing for Israel is to make sure that its posture of deterrence is being bolstered. On October 7, it was demolished completely. We have restored it, and much more so since October 8. And posture of deterrence is the cornerstone not only of future peace with Arab countries, not only for expanding the peace process, but even for our relations with the U.S. and Israel which concedes, and Israel which offers gestures, and Israel which hesitates is anything but a deterring Israel. And a deterring Israel is of no use to the Abraham Accord Arab countries, which have chosen to conclude peace with Israel because they see Israel as an ally in deterring the Ayatollah of Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood.
Well, since you raised,
we must not sacrifice posture of deterrence on the altar of diplomatic convenience.
Right. Since you raised the Abraham Accords, it was interesting to note that, for example, Jared Kushner, one of the architects, which we haven't really seen very active in the Trump administration this time around, was at this meeting. Tony Blair, who certainly views, perhaps in some ways, it differs from certainly the current Israeli government's view of the Palestinian situation, taking part in this meeting. We did not hear about the sort of Trump plan we heard earlier in the year of resettling the Palestinians out of Gaza. Do you think that Trump vision, that Trump has he given up that vision, embracing maybe other postures on Gaza? Again, how do you feel that the administration is going in its direction on the sort of day after in Gaza?
Well, logically speaking, President Trump respects entities that adapt the Trump-like behavior, Trump-like policy conduct. And Trump does not wait for a green light. Trump does not stop on a red light in the pursuit of his interest. And I have no doubt in my mind that while he may not like an Israel which defies his suggestion or his policy, he would immensely respect an Israel which acts exactly the way Trump would behave. And he gave us more than a hint when he said, if Hamas doesn't follow 1, 2, 3 expectations, all hell will break loose. And he didn't mean that it would be the U.S. hell which is going to fall upon Hamas. He simply conveyed a message. Israel, you have my permission to treat Hamas the way hell would treat Hamas. And the question is, again, are we going to act like Trump? Or are we going to act like Tony Blair, who has been wrong and wronger and wrongest on the Palestinian issue and on the Middle East at large?
All right, let me turn from Gaza to another area, another front where the U.S. is taking a very active role, sometimes not perhaps on the same timetable as Israel, and that's Lebanon. As we mentioned earlier this week, Prime Minister Netanyahu saying Israel would withdraw its outposts from Lebanon if we saw the decommissioning of weapons of Hezbollah. There's this vote today on UNIFIL. Again, are Israel and the U.S. On the same page when it comes to Lebanon? And how do you feel about Israel saying it's going to pull back from that border area, which it took up in order to deter Hezbollah?
Well, it seems to me that Israel has to be on the same page with the Middle East, And in the Middle East, going back 1,400 years until this very day, agreements, accords, policies are tenuous. This has been the story of the Middle East, the shifty Middle East, the unpredictable Middle East. We had a Middle East with a staunch ally for the U.S. in Iran, and that staunch ally has become the epicenter of anti-American terrorism and drug trafficking. We had a new leader coming to Syria in the year 2000, Bashar Assad, and top policymakers in the U.S. embraced him as a message of moderation to Syria, only to find out that this is a worse butcher than was his father. The U.S. had a one of the most important Air Force bases anywhere in the world, in Libya until 1969. And then came Gaddafi, and Gaddafi became an anti-terrorist warrior.
Well, let's get specifically on. Let's get to Lebanon. How should Israel react to these developments there? Yoram, do we have him? Okay, it looks like we're having some a technical issue there. So I'm going to move on. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has slammed Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for what he called politically motivated recognition of the Armenian genocide. The comments by Erdogan followed remarks by Netanyahu, who for the first time publicly acknowledged the massacres carried out by the Ottoman Empire against Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks in the early 20th century. Erdogan described Netanyahu's remarks concerning the events of 1915 as an attempt to exploit past tragedies for political motivation, and Erdogan called the remarks incompatible with historical and legal facts in order to cover up the war crimes currently being committed by Netanyahu and his government. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu made the comments on a show hosted by U.S. podcaster Patrick Bet-David, who asked the Prime Minister why he had not recognized the Armenian genocide.
Why haven't you yet recognized the Armenian, Assyrian, and the Greek genocide that the Turkish did to that community?
In fact, I think we have, because I think the Knesset passed a resolution to that effect.
I don't know if it's come from you, though. I don't know if it's come from the Prime Minister of Israel.
Yeah, I just did.
Okay.
Here you go.
All right. Well, thank you for doing that. Thank you for doing that. I appreciate you. That's important to me. And I'm sure a lot of Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks around the world appreciate you saying that.
Just to clarify, a Knesset subcommittee did recognize the Armenian genocide back in 2016, but an attempt to get full parliamentary approval for such a resolution failed 2 years later due to a lack of government backing. Elsewhere, Iran's ambassador to Australia, Ahmad Sadeghi, made his first public comments today since he was ordered to leave the country. This after the Australian government said agents of the Revolutionary Guard Corps were behind attacks directed at local Jewish communities. Here's what the ambassador had to say outside his Canberra residence.
Mr. Ambassador, just for a moment, we just want to have to say what you have to say. I love, Australian people. I love Australian people. Do you believe that Iran are behind these attacks? Just, I love Australian people. Bye-bye. Mr. Ambassador.
Australian authorities charged Iran with using local criminals to carry out the arson attacks over the past year against Jewish targets, paying them thousands of dollars via proxies to firebomb a synagogue in Melbourne and a Jewish deli in the Sydney suburb of Bondi. 2 suspects have been arrested. One of them, Yunus Ala Yunus, was charged yesterday in a Melbourne court for the attempted synagogue bombing. Well, for more on the story, let's go to Melbourne and speak to Joel Burnie. He's Executive Manager, Australia, Israel, and Jewish Affairs Council, AIJAC. Joel, thank you so much for being here. Well, the Iranian ambassador loves the Australian people, but the Australian Jews, maybe not so much. But seriously, just your reaction to just what has been learned, the extent of these plots, the details that have been covered just in the past couple of days.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. And it's been a very rough time for Australian Jewry since the horrific events of October 7. We all have seen the deterioration of the streets of Australia and the attacks against Jews that happened no less than a couple of hours after Hamas infiltrated the south of Israel on October 7, 2023. 2 days later, we had the scenes at the Opera House that shocked the world. And progressively since that time, the anti-Semitism problem has just got worse and worse and worse. And so it all culminated in late last year with a spate of very violent fire bombings, including the burning down of the Adass synagogue, which sent shockwaves through the Australian Jewish community, petrified the whole community, because it was one attack after another attack. Community leaders' homes were targeted, childcare centres were targeted, and it's turned out, as the Prime Minister came out a couple of days ago, that two of these fire bombings, some of the worst attacks that we've seen, were indeed connected to the IRGC and to the Iranian regime. And as a consequence, the Australian government has booted the Iranian ambassador, made him persona non grata, the first time that an Australian government has booted out an ambassador since the end of World War II in the 1940s. And also, and most importantly, will now legislate to list the IRGC as a terror organization. The one last point before we can move on, it's very important to understand how it all went down. So the Iranians were very clever with what they did. They used an intermediary based in the Middle East who spent time in an Australian prison, and after he was released from prison, he was kicked out of Australia and was extradited to Iraq. And there appears to be a middleman here, and that person is directly connected with a web of organized crime here in Australia. So it went through different hands. The Iranians tried very hard to conceal it, but thankfully the intelligence agencies were able to uncover the links between what happened here in Australia and the IRGC.
Right. Now, we should note, actually, that even though the charges, as you said, were brought in these specific attacks, authorities say the Iranian plot may be linked to some of the other incidents. There may be more individuals out there who have not been apprehended. So taking that into account, along with, as you said, just a surge in domestic anti-Semitism in Australia, how is the Australian Jewish community coping? How secure or not are you feeling these days?
Secure? Do we feel secure? Probably not, but we're a very strong and resilient community. So we're a community of about 115,000, an insanely and very strong Zionist community, very proud of its connection and love and affinity towards Israel. But it has suffered greatly. We used to live in what was as close to a utopia in a diaspora community could ever have. Full freedoms, Jewish people rose to all the ranks in all different areas of civil society in Australia. And then what we saw is not just that anti-Semitism came out of the closet, it was completely unleashed, and it's very, very hard to put the genie back in the bottle. So there have been a series of increasingly violent attacks against Jewish targets, thousands of anti-Semitic incidents, a huge 350 to 400% rise in anti-Semitic attacks. And the idea is right, Khaled. What you've said is that we've only caught a few of them. Obviously, the Iranians deny that their involvement, but our intelligence agencies are quite confident that Iran is probably behind more attacks. And we do know that the assets are still probably here, and the Iranians still have cells here actively in Australia. Cyber espionage is also high on their priority list. So it's not as though that the Jewish community can rest easy. But what I will say is that the Australian authorities have taken this very seriously. There were accusations at the start that they might have been slow to react, but you can understand that these types of things don't really happen in Australia very often. So there's no doubt that the agencies have resourced themselves adequately, and it's a slow and painful investigative process, but it seems as though they've done a diligent job in uncovering the connection with Iran here.
And Joel, we should note these Iranian plots already stretched back over a year ago, and there have been anti-Semitic incidents on the right since October 7th. But there has been criticism here in Israel, I assume in Australia also, of some of the recent statements and actions taken by the Australian government, by Prime Minister Albanese, who, as you said, has acted promptly and strongly in this circumstance, but criticism of their position on the Palestinian state issue, on the banning of some Israelis from traveling to Australia. I mean, how criticism that it just adds to a charged atmosphere. It doesn't help the situation. What is the position of the Australian Jewish community, which is a diverse community, we should note, about this?
Yeah, look, I'll note that it's been a deteriorating relationship since this Labor government first came into power 3.5 years ago. And we'll all remember a year before the horrific events of October 7, in actual fact, a year to the date, on Simchat Torah of 2022, the Australian government clumsily announced that it was reversing the previous government's decision of recognition of West Jerusalem as Israel's capital. So that happened a year before October 7. And then subsequent to October 7, this current Australian government has taken major leaps away from what was a traditionally strong bipartisan position towards Israel. Australia was a very close bilateral friend and partner of Israel and stood side by side with Israel over the 7 decades of her existence. There was a deep divide and trajectory away from that culminated ultimately to 2 weeks ago with the Prime Minister announcing his intention to recognize Palestine at the upcoming UN General Assembly. So with the visa with Simcha Rothman, for instance, when Simcha Rothman's visa was rejected, many in the Jewish community would certainly disagree with his positions on judicial overhaul, for instance. However, the idea that a sitting member of the Knesset has his visa rejected here in Australia is a very jarring thing for all Australians, and as you pointed out, greatly increases the anxiety levels felt in this community. But I want to make one thing clear. Even though this is a different type of our history here in Australia, even though many Australian Jews feel targeted and are very scared and anxious, one thing that we are is strong and resilient, and we will dig in, we will find ways to persevere, and we will keep fighting for what is a proud Australian Jewish history. Australian Jews have given a lot to this country, and we're not going anywhere.
Right. And then those who know the history of Australian Jewry know it's been a refuge, for example, for Jews. So many Jewish refugees had to flee the Holocaust, etc. Joel, we wish you the best there in Australia. Here from Israel, Joe Burnie from the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council. Thanks for joining us on ILTV.
Thank you for having me.
And it's not just Australia. Israelis, for example, continue to be targeted elsewhere abroad. In Spain, the Israel premier tech cycling team was targeted by pro-Palestinian protesters blocking their path at the Vuelta a España competition. Several people with banners and flags are seen on video trying to disrupt the team, which is owned by the Israeli-Canadian billionaire philanthropist Sylvan Adams. This happened at the start of the 5th stage time trial in Figueres, Catalonia. Now, some of the riders on the Israeli team were forced to slow down, but no accidents were reported. In a statement, the team said it absolutely condemns the dangerous acts of the protesters, which compromise the safety of our riders, race personnel, and the protesters themselves. The Israel Premier Tech team, by the way, was also targeted during the Tour de France race. Now, back in the U.S., President Trump is now taking aim at George Soros. President Trump saying on Wednesday that Soros and his son Alexander should be prosecuted under the Racketeer Influenced and Corruptions Act, or better known as the RICO Act. In a post on his Truth Social platform, Trump accused Soros of backing violent protests across the U.S. He wrote, George Soros and his wonderful radical left son should be charged with RICO because of their support of violent protests and much more all throughout the United States of America. Soros and his group of psychopaths have caused great damage to our country. That includes his crazy West Coast friends. Be careful, we are watching you. Now, the RICO statute, which President Trump references, is a federal law that was passed in 1970 to fight organized crime. It allows authorities to prosecute groups engaged in repeated illegal activity. It's been used against drug cartels, mobsters, and other criminal enterprises. Critics say Trump's call for charges is reflective of his growing use of combative rhetoric against those who oppose his political views. Now, George Soros is a 95-year-old Holocaust survivor from Hungary who made his fortune as a financier and later founded the Open Society Foundations. His son Alexander has been overseeing the foundation since 2023. Trump's comments are the latest in a series of attacks on Soros, who remains a frequent target of conservative criticism and conspiracy theories for his support of left-wing causes and organizations. And that ends this broadcast of ILTV. Of course, we continue giving you the most important updates coming from Israel and the Middle East. But for now, you can keep up with us on our ILTV app. You can just scan that code, which is appearing on your screen now. I'm Caleb Ben David. This is ILTV News. And thank you for watching.